Okay, we're going to get started with our third panel. And this is a panel that's going to talk about the ways that we can measure the impact of the programs that we're running. Moderator for this panel is Danielle Berman, and Danielle runs her own consultancy called DB Consulting. Tackle what's next. So Danielle, welcome.
All right, I'm gonna get our panel up here. So I just want to first introduce Jim Dower, the founder of Urban Initiatives here in Chicago. We have Vinay Mullick from UpMetrics, the managing director. We have Lisa Delpy Neirotti from the George Washington University in DC. We have Jason Schraub from Operation Hope, Regional Vice President of Midwest. And last but certainly not least, we have Pharlone Toussaint from the Laureus Sport for Good Foundation.
Should take her podium mic. Take the podium.
Okay, so Pharlone had a really good idea just to get the blood flow moving. So if everyone can stand up, take a couple deep breaths, maybe roll your shoulders, do a couple back bends, and then get the blood flow moving. Say hi to your neighbor, you know. Awesome. All right, great. Now everybody's got the blood flow going. We're going to talk some impact measurement today. So we have a really great panel of experts here, a number of different backgrounds and perspectives that I think will be really important for everybody to hear from. So I want to start with an open-ended question just about the prioritization of measuring impact. So anyone that wants to jump in here, what should we be prioritizing when we're measuring impact? What's that most important thing in your mind of what we should be prioritizing?
Go wide. Wide.
I'll
Go wide.
start it out at the end.
Go wide.
I think when it comes to thinking about your work and prioritizing impact, it's really thinking about, for initiatives, it's thinking about what is the goal of the work, right? What is your theory of change? What are you setting out to do? What's your claim? And then, how are you doing it, right? Are you shining that reflective light on yourself and saying, is this program delivering for the students or the family or the neighborhood or the district that we work on behalf of?
Sure. And you've done a really great job at Urban Initiatives, Jim, of really prioritizing that from the top down. Has that affected what you're doing in the community?
Yes, sort of. I'd have to give a huge amount of credit to our team. I'm certainly the founder, but I'm one of many brilliant team members who have really dedicated an incredible amount of time in this space. I think one of the things that I love about our data culture, it is pervasive throughout the company, right? We have 3 full-time people, but hundreds of folks are involved in our work around data evaluation, and do it not because our director of data evaluation says, but because they understand how important it is to the authenticity of the work that we're doing.
Sure. And Jason, we've talked about this a little bit, but at Operation Hope, you guys actually changed a lot of your programming based on the evaluations you were getting back. So can you talk a little bit about what that was like? Was it scary? What was that like, getting that feedback and making those changes?
Well, I must say I actually wasn't there when we made that change about 5 years ago. But the biggest thing that we're thinking about is, instead of measuring outputs, we want to measure outcomes. And so it's not about how many people did you see. It's about what happened, right? Were they able to get to the place of what you're trying to achieve? For us, it's around economic inclusion and economic equality in neighborhoods where traditionally that has not been the case. And so just to talk a little bit about why we're here on the measurement front, we needed to see a balance of two directions, which is one, are we measuring that we're having the impact that we want to have, that people are getting the opportunities to thrive that they may not have had before, but also from a storytelling perspective, are we able to create something compelling to get people to see it, to understand it, and to use it. And so what our programming was, we actually used to be in the center of the city. We were in 7 cities nationwide, where we would have everything you could need from a financial and economic perspective to grow. We would have credit counseling and home ownership coaches and entrepreneurship, technical assistance and all that. And the model didn't really work because what we were finding is that even though the people who were coming in were having some amount of success, we weren't actually getting people in the door because we were asking people to go to a place they didn't feel welcome, to talk to people that they didn't know about a topic upon which they weren't comfortable, and it really didn't match what we were trying to get to. And so 5 years ago, we flipped the model where we now sit inside of an existing community institution, inside of the neighborhoods that people already are, working with people that you already know from inside of the neighborhood. And since 2014, have grown from those 7 cities now to 39 states and 140 locations around the United States. And that's, thank you. And that's through frankly finding that our first 22 years, we were not doing what we needed to do, and we weren't hitting the goals that we had for our mission.
Oh, you like it?
I just want to go back to this conversation about priority. I woke up this morning and the headline was, Joe Biden says that poor kids are just as good as white kids. Just go look. Poor kids can be just as good as white kids. This was the vice president to the first black president in this country. The priority in monitoring and evaluating yourself as an organization is equity. And making sure you understand that you cannot think that way. And I know that Joe Biden's a cool dude. We like him, right? In the black community, we think he's a G, right? But I'm gonna be very frank with you about this. Because if you're in this room, it's because you have a certain level of privilege, like I do, right? You need to make sure that you have really examined as an individual, deep down inside, your understanding of the issues that we face and deal with as a country. Because our leaders are comparing poverty. Poor kids are just as good as white kids. If you have assumptions about the community you're trying to serve, if you have ideas or things that you were nurtured and taught to think about the people you claim you want to help, you need to go back and examine those things, because I guarantee you, you're not going to help anybody with those preconceived notions. You're not going to make impact with those assumptions. You're just going to continue to make the problem something that will never change. You're going to be a Band-Aid to a deeper issue. So you need to go back as an individual and examine yourself and examine your preconceived notions, your assumptions, and tell yourself the truth. Do you think that all kids of color are poor? Because I guarantee you that the people in Appalachia, there are lots of poor white kids that should be offended by the fact that they weren't even considered, right? So when we talk about prioritizing, monitoring, and evaluating stuff, equity needs to be at the center of that. Are you asking the right survey questions? Are you making assumptions about those survey questions? Are you even thinking, or do you even know what the real problems are to ask the right questions? Or are you just making assumptions based on the things that we have systemically thought about based on race, gender, socioeconomic background? Because if you're doing that, then all the M&E that you spent consultant money on, all the consultants or the training that you did is trash. It's a waste of your time and energy.
I think that's a great point, and that was great brings me to Vinay, because Vinay, I know we do a lot with quantitative data, and what Pharlone's talking about is really bringing in some of that qualitative and understanding who your community is, talking to them and getting that qualitative data. At UpMetrics, are you guys doing anything about that? Have you experienced kind of putting that kind of data together?
Yeah, so with the qualitative side, I mean, that is more of a struggle with groups, because a lot of groups struggle to just get going quantitatively. What we've seen with a lot of the kind of K-12, K-20 groups that we're working with is social emotional learning has been a kind of an assessment area or focus area for a lot of these groups that have historically been a qualitative sort of assessment process. And we've been able to partner with a few organizations that we've been able to quantitate a former kind of heavy quantitative or qualitative means of SEL. So there's a big push for it. It's a struggle. You have groups that are 2 folks with a founding executive director and 1 assistant to 20 staff, and that process can be different for everyone in between. But everyone wants social emotional learning now. It's a hot button. It's impactful, and those insights really can help dictate how programs turn and look at their impact and how they can help more folks. And to Pharlone's point of equity, access and equity is huge, and that's something that when we go in and work with groups, we start with who are you serving? Is it accessible? Is it equitable? How can we help? And it's, again, like you said, not just quantitative but qualitative as well. So.
Sure. And Lisa, I want to bring it to you because I know from the university perspective, you've done a lot of the research and been involved in some of the research, especially now with this new Kids Retiring from Sport campaign that's coming out. And I think everyone in the room is probably interested in that. But from your perspective, how does the measurement impact measuring impact and evaluating that data, how is that important to those kinds of things, and why, in your experience, has it been important to prioritize it?
Well, I kind of wanted to answer that first. What should we be measuring?
Sure.
I mean, there are existing tools out there, so I want to make sure everybody knows Hello Inside and UpMetrics, but areas that I see that we're missing in data collection is what about those people we lose? The retention rate. So how many of you belong to gyms? If you don't show up for a week or 2, what happens? You get a little message. You say, hey, where are you? And it's a business model, because if you don't come to a gym, you're gonna stop using their membership, right? You're gonna stop paying them. Well, we need to take, I think, that approach of, like, everybody, we should now be collecting their cell phones. Most kids that we're working with have some sort of communication tool, or even the parents' contact, right? So if we can kind of build that relationship, and we've found, the research shows that the whole reason we're in this business is to build relationships. That's the thing that's gonna help these kids the most. If we really care about them, they feel like they have somebody who cares about them. If we can then reach out and say, where are you? We miss you. And then trying to figure out why they're not coming, why not staying. So it's hard, but I think there are programs out there. Health club industry uses it very well, and I think we can model ours off of that. So that's one area. The other one is a little bit more far-reaching, but through grants, it's possible. I've just written a grant about using Fitbit. Again, research out there, paper and pen, pencils, even if surveys. There's now biometrics that can tell you how people are feeling. There's also biometrics that can tell you how much physical activity did these kids actually get in their program. We say that we're bringing them in and giving them all this exercise, but is that true? If they're wearing a Fitbit, you can get their heart rate. You can find out how many minutes they were physically engaged. This is a little scary for us, because what happens if that feedback comes back and doesn't really show we're doing what we're saying we're doing? But it's worth taking that risk, because as you found, we can change. So anyway, I've talked a lot here. I'll stop.
No, that's great. I think that brings us to a good point, is there is a lot of hesitation when it comes to measuring impact for the exact reason that you talked about, Lisa, and Jason as well, as what if the results are not positive? Pharlone, I'd love to talk to you guys. I know at Laureus you guys are doing a lot about kind of putting together resources, putting together opportunities for organizations to learn more about this and kind of fight that hesitation. So I'd love you to talk about, you know, what you've experienced and why do you think there is that hesitation? What can we do about it?
Certainly. So my colleague Tiffany mentioned this platform that we've invested in called Sport for Good Connect. I would definitely go and check that out, just so you know that that there are places where you can go and get anything you need to know or training that you need to understand the basics of monitoring and evaluating yourself. I also think that in your bag in there is something called the State of Sport for Good report. I want to point out two things in that report that I think are really important, especially because there are some great deal of consultants in the room. We surveyed hundreds of sport-based youth development organizations in this country who claim to be using sport as a tool for youth development. And we found that about 74% of them said that they did have the capacity and also the technical skills that they needed to monitor and evaluate themselves. So we are making a lot of assumptions and misunderstandings about people are actually, especially sport-based youth development organizations, they are actually not only getting the resources they need, hopefully from us and all the other organizations who value that, but they're also prioritizing it in their staff. So Jim and all the other people here who are using platforms, you're just an example of a program that says we are doing what we need to do to make sure that the impact we are making, we can say is true. Another thing I want folks to understand is that in that same State of Sport for Good report, 57% of those people said that they didn't just monitor and evaluate because donors asked them to. Okay? So people are not just doing it because funders are requiring them to do it. Sport-based youth development organizations, at least, are doing it because they really do want to see a change in the students and the young people and the multi-generational people that they're working with. So when we talk about resources, you know, Laureus is all about uplifting the sector. Our work here in Chicago at Sport for Good Chicago is all about understanding how a community can come together and share what their issues are and be the solutions to their own problems, right? Our job is to make sure that we act as a backbone and support their needs and listen to what they understand to be the issues, because they are their own solution to their problems. We're not coming in to swoop in and be a savior to anybody. We know that if they have the right resources and if they have the right empowerment and support and a desire to work with one another, that they're going to do what the survey says they do. They are collecting data, which means they are probably making impact. And so for me, it's very important to understand especially because there are a lot of consultants in the room, you know, if there is a lack of understanding where the resources are, what we can do, I mean, is it more marketing and promotions? Is it, you know, are you at the right place at the right time? Because the resources are out there, you know, UpMetrics, Hello Insight. It's been proven that, you know, platforms are being used every day to make impact, and we try our best in Sport for Good New Orleans, Sport for Good Atlanta, New York, Chicago, LA. I mean, we're trying our best to make sure that the people who are on the ground doing the work have what they need. But, you know, if there's still a misunderstanding about where to go, I want to make sure that we have the right information to make sure that they know where to get it.
Put a clarification on that. So trash in is trash out. We have to be really careful that whoever was filling the survey out could say, oh yes, I really support data collection, but they need to support the people on the ground collecting it. So all the coaches need to be incentivized and motivated to make sure that what they're collecting and how they're doing it is accurate, so we really are getting the best data that we can. And I think all of us really need to emphasize that and support those people, remind them and give them of incentives to enter in their data after each.
I mean, but if you're a program that like has a child where like their mother is a crackhead, or like the only time that they ever get to eat is at school, you know, like that's one of the things that's probably going to be really hard for a coach to care about, you know. But to me, it's very important that, you know, if you're a leader and you are a person who cares about monitoring and evaluating your programs and making sure that the data is true and that we're at least collecting data even though we're dealing with fires, right? Even though that we're dealing with the worst of it, then provide technology to make sure that those things are happening. That trash in, trash out, making sure that, you know, and I'll be honest, our partners with UpMetrics have made it very easy for programs who are dealing with extremely difficult circumstances can just take out their phones and do what they need to do immediately so they can deal with the terrible issues or the very difficult things that the youth come to them with every day. But I think technology is the solution to that. That's a beautiful point.
Yeah, and Vinay, can you talk on that a little bit about what you guys have seen?
Yeah, I mean, we have a great relationship with Laureus nationally, and you know, happy to be up here with you and everyone else. But the technology tools that we provide, you know, go to an example that Pharlone just kind of described. A lot of us on our team are former social sector folks, we're coaches, teachers. I was an athletic director for 9+ years, so we've seen it, we get it. And we have a suite of tools that will allow coaches, frontline staff, which are our most important folks outside of the communities that we serve and the kids that we're serving, we're helping them, empower them to do things like take attendance, mark here, mark late, mark absent within 5 seconds. Because we know that time that you have at the beginning of practice, at the end of a session, or at 11:30 at night when you're about to go to bed, you're like, oh man, I forgot to take attendance, you need to do it real quick. You can do that within 30 seconds or less. And so we've developed tech tools, we've developed systems based on the feedback of former frontline social sector folks to really empower the organizations with that frontline, that key data. And that's the game changer, because we could all sit here and say, you know, I had a conversation with someone yesterday with a cohort of groups we're working with, and he was like, hey, you keep talking about, you know, how many people that are served, and you're not talking about outcomes and this and that. And it was someone newer into the field, and I said to him, I said, to even get to outcomes, you gotta start with your outputs, right? And if you don't know who you're serving, we can't talk about college persistent, we can talk about wealth transformation, we can't do any of that till you know race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic, zip code. And so that's our goal, is to empower folks. That 74%, that's powerful. I didn't know that. Like, that's really cool. But the question is, of that 74, is do they have their output data, right? And I say some do, some don't. So then let's challenge them and get them to their outcome data. So, and then that's kind of the second phase of how we work with groups as well. So,
And you know, this may complicate things even a little further, but the other aspect here is in people, and it is having our frontline staff have an ownership mentality over their business and over their aspect of the organization and the world. You know, my background, I come from actually a corporate sales background, and when you're a little cog in the machine, it's hard to be convinced to put your data into the CRM. You know, why do I care that the company knows who I made a phone call with or what have you? And I think we face the same thing in a nonprofit, where we need to make sure that our people feel that ownership and feel that empowerment, that what I do makes a difference, and when I put the right things in here and when I show results, that I have the opportunity to take that information and actually improve my program, or improve my performance, or to improve my neighborhood, and that I can use this to be better and do more.
Yeah, no, I think you guys have all brought up really interesting points, and I think as a fellow consultant, for those of you in the room, it's great to hear that people are measuring impact, because that is something I think a lot of people don't assume is happening. But I want to go to you, Jim, here for a second and say, okay, so people are measuring impact. It seems like they're prioritizing it. Where are we still missing? What's still the gap? I think in your experience with someone that's really embraced it from the top down. What's next?
So I think one of the things that can always cloud these types of conversations is that there's one thing, right? There's not one thing that that our system needs that will be fixed for SPYD, etc. So it's a multitude of things. I think one is to the point, like how are the team members and really the students that we work with, the families who we coach alongside of, how is the data becoming empowering and important to them, right? It's their data. It's their knowledge. It's their power. So making sure that they own that before anybody else does, and that is what's getting them excited to come to practice. That's what's exciting a coach to run the highest quality session is kind of how that data flows back into that continuous quality improvement plan. That's super important.
AC.
And that is what I think builds a really vibrant data culture, is when it lives in that space, right? So I think that's really important. I think the funding community continuing to evolve and understand the importance of funding that space. I mean, we just did one of the largest randomized control trials in Chicago, and I think maybe nationally, but it was hard finding those dollars. And there's I think heightening that in the community, and I think there's a lot of real conversations happening at the foundation level in terms of privilege, in terms of access, and that very important self-reflective light is finally being shown on some of the decisions that they've made that have maybe driven poor decision making, for the past 20 years, right? And wrestling with those conversations are real and really important. I think that's where some of the gaps will naturally start to fill themselves in as we have more honest conversations about where the money comes from, why it's coming there, and how to build real evaluation equity, to your point, into what you're trying to do. And those are hard conversations that, frankly, people are afraid to have. And that's okay, right? It's okay to be afraid, but it's not okay to not have.
That's a great point to make. And as we're at the sports philanthropy thing here,
World Congress.
I think it's very telling that sports philanthropists aren't in the room, because to your point, right? I don't know who else, on my team, why they came, but I'm a nosy neighbor. And I wanted to know what sports philanthropists were gonna show up and really, be okay with being held accountable to something like that, right? At Laureus, we're very, we're all about learning in public and understanding that we may have very lived experiences that may help in making the right decisions, but we also understand that there are other people who may have better lived experiences. So, I think when we talk about sports philanthropy, this industry is $1 billion industry, right? I heard people talking about scarcity and people talking, this is $1 billion industry. The fact that there are no owners of teams in here, or, shout out to Mr. Draft for being in here, but, other players or other people who coin themselves as sports philanthropists who are not here to hear this conversation, shame on them, right? Because if your title on LinkedIn says sports philanthropist and you're in Chicago, you need to go find them and make sure they're here to be a part of this conversation, because they are claiming to be sports philanthropists. And folks here are saying, we need sports philanthropists to listen to our needs if they really want to be sports philanthropists. So to me, it seems that there's a little bit of we're preaching to the choir, right? Folks who know what they need to do are here. Folks who have a voice and need to, I just wonder where the sports philanthropists are, other than Laureus. I think we give more money than the professional sports teams globally. NBA Cares doesn't give half of what we do globally.
I want to shout out to Laureus as well, getting to your point, talking to the youth. You just had youth leadership and understanding what those youth need. And I'm just going to tie this back into measurement since we're here. Big data and data analysis is a huge career path now. And so if we can even engage our youth in doing this data collection for us and analysis for us, it's going to come out with an outcome that we want, which is employment opportunities. So we need to start thinking, how do we train our participants to do some of our data collection and analysis for us and hold them responsible for that.
Look at you, solution focused.
I tried.
So piggybacking on to Pharlone here, there is definitely a conversation that needs to be had around sports, philanthropy, foundations, and supporting measurement. And, you know, foundations love the buzzwords of theory of change. Hopefully you guys are getting warm over here. And capacity building, right? But when you say that and you tie that to measurement support and resources, and you know, I'm in a business development role, so I deal with that all the time. There are not many folks like our Laureus friends here today that step up and say, yep, let's get the frontline data, let's support the SBYDs, and then let's go get the school district data, which UpMetrics did in Atlanta. There's a whole story behind that, but somehow we did it, right? And no one's really doing that. And I sit with foundations regularly, sports and non-sports, and when you talk about supporting the capacity building in the measurement and evaluation world, a lot of times calls go unreturned, you know, places are blank, and that's tough, right? And this goes from, you know, big sports teams to small family foundations to donor advised funds, whatever it might be. And there's been a few leaders in the space, and we're excited to work with them, and Laureus is one of them. But we need more of that, and to do that, we need more of the frontline SBYDs advocating for that and saying, like, hey, this is what we need to obviously stay sustainable, raise more funds, and then grow 2, 3, 4, 5x. And I think that's a big issue with the space, coming from the programmatic side for about 12 years and now being on this side. I think the disconnect is pretty great. So.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, and I think the theme of today, of all the panels so far, has really been collaboration. I think that really speaks to the measuring impact, to what Pharlone's saying, to what Jim's saying, Vinay and Lisa. Everyone has made this point. You need to be working with not only your team internally, but those people out there in the community, your community leaders, but also organizations around you that are affecting you. So if you're working with a local community organization where you house your programs, like Jason talked about, how are they helping you collect data? And how are the people in your circle of, of trust that you're working with every day, how are they helping you work towards measuring impact? So before we open it to questions, because I think we're about at that time, I just want everyone to touch, or whoever's comfortable touching on this, how are you working with others? And Laureus obviously is doing that a lot, but Jason, Jim, who else are you working with out in the community to collect this data?
We jump in here just for quick, because some of you have heard me. This is my latest push is working closer with the justice system, and I think Chicago Run actually has started a program with them. They collect some data. Each place is different, but I really believe that if we want to work with those kids at most risk, we need to better communicate and understand what parole officers, what are they doing, what are their responsibilities, what are the juvenile detention centers doing, how can we better work with them so those kids, when they come out, they can get referred right into one of our programs. We have lots of programs, there's so many programs. That's why we started the Sports Philanthropy Certificate program, because I kept getting all these calls, help me fundraise, help me do this, and I'm like, okay. So there's lots of programs out there. How do we better funnel the kids most at risk into them and then work more collaboratively?
I'm really glad you asked that question, because the other thing I think that we've been dancing around a little bit is there's a lot of noise, right? I mean, there are so many organizations that are competing for your attention, your dollars, your thoughts, everything. And so where we can use measurement and partnership is to clear out a lot of the noise. And when it's a collaboration of 3 or 4 or 5 different organizations coming together and saying, hey, we believe that this is the right way forward, it's a whole lot easier to get the attention of any philanthropist, let alone a sports philanthropist. So for example, here in Chicago, what we look to do is every single neighborhood where we open a what we call a Hope Inside Center, which is where we bring this financial inclusion and economic inclusion model, there needs to be at least one community sponsor, at least one corporate sponsor, and at least one government sponsor. So even if we have the money, we still won't open up the space until there is a community group that has signed their name and their logo onto it, a corporation that has signed their name and their logo onto it, and a government entity. So in Brownsville, for instance, we have a partnership of Bright Star Community Outreach, which is a church and a trauma-informed care organization, CIBC, a bank, Ariel Investments, an investment company, and the city treasurer of Chicago, Melissa Conyers-Urban. And we believe that you need to have all of those groups signing on together on a model and on a process in order to reduce the noise and make yourself stand up above the fray.
Does anyone have any questions for the panel? Great.
My name is Patrick Fisher. I'm the president of Character Measures. I'm almost don't even know where to start. You guys have hit so many buzzwords in my world. I'm what's called a psychometrician. I have almost 2 decades of experience with high-stakes certification testing with medical and dental certification boards. I've taken that and brought it I've taken those processes and brought it over to character assessment. But really what I want to address is what you've commented on about measurement and evaluation, and your use of the word noise have really got my buzz going, because noise is what we see in the data a lot, and it's one of the things you're trying to understand to do exactly as you're saying. You want to get the noise out of the data, because that causes the variance in the data that you can't explain. And so we need to understand the data, and that's the variance that we can understand and do something with. That's the results, that's the real meat that can drive decisions forward. So yeah, I could go on and on. I'm going to stop myself before I do. But I'm a social scientist, I'm a psychometrician, I'm a data analyst. This is what I do. And so a lot of the questions you guys have about, the last panel was talking about how to improve your programs. Well, how do you improve them? You measure them. Measure them. It's we measure what we want to be. So it's time we start really measuring it and doing it. And the particular, I'm not just your regular data analyst. I was educated at the University of Chicago, and in a field, a particular measurement theory called the Roche model, Roche measurement. It's a very narrow niche within the world of psychometrics. The rest of psychometrics is this wide, Roche measurement is this wide, and it is all over all of the medical and dental certification boards. The nurses use it. There's 250,000 nurses certified every year. Doctors, all the doctor boards, almost all of them use Roche measurement to certify doctors. My point being that if it's good enough for doctors and nurses who have everybody's lives in their hands, it's good enough for sports philanthropy.
Thank you. And I think you bring up a good point too, that this ties into all of the panels today, measuring impact effects, programming, organizational structure, everything. So thank you for that.
Hi, I'm Danya Rose, and thank you for the shout out, Lisa. I'm the executive director for Chicago Run. We're a sports-based youth development program partnering with over 19,000 young people here in Chicago, using running as a fundamental vehicle for change. And as we talk about measurement and outcomes and equity, I'm gonna quote the very beautiful Laureus report. We know that only half of organizations working with Laureus were able to even track engagement of LGBTQ youth. And this is not something that's distinct to SBYD, the CDC's Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System. Ooh, that's a mouthful. Only started tracking, asking questions about gender, identity, and sexual orientation in 2015, or was it 2017? Very recently. As we think about the community, particularly for queer, trans, and non-binary folks, and particularly queer and trans folks of color, we know that there are disproportionate health disparities. So the question, I guess, is how do we as a community better engage with and address that gap and actually have the evidence and better measure and partner with the queer and trans community?
I just want to say, I think that's such a great point to bring up, and it kind of, I was looking for that man who asked that question about adaptive sports earlier, and they're not the same obviously, but a very underserved and understood a demographic. And I think one of the things, I particularly in Sport Forget Atlanta have a lot of conversations and prioritize hard to reach, like literally meaning hard to reach, right? So, we know that this particular population, LGBTQIA, especially in the sports world, is almost under attack. And unfortunately, as an ally, I've got to go out and seek people who are prioritizing that and building relationships with that, building the trust with them so they can come to the table and really help us all understand what their needs and what their resources and what their requirements are. But I think it is up to me as an ally to go out and seek that information and seek those relationships, because sometimes those people don't feel heard or seen. And so if you don't feel heard or seen, why would you show up to a Sport for Good Atlanta meeting where the Hawks and the Falcons and all these important people are there, and you think that you're not gonna get a second to say anything about how hard it is to track down the kids in your program because they're homeless, right? I think that it's important that we all act as allies, even if we don't have those experiences, to make sure that we address that, because it's very difficult to know what the needs of those programs and organizations are without them being at the table. But they shouldn't be chasing us. We need to be making sure we make room for them, for sure.
Maybe we partner more with the World Day Games and the individual state and local areas that are working in that area too.
I'll chime in real quick, Danielle. To that, I would say the idea of educating providers more on outreach and sensitivities, awareness, I think is huge. Because I think, as times change, in these roles, folks are struggling to just get jobs done. And I think when things like that happen, groups are forgotten about. And if there's a way that we can, overarchingly support reaching all participants, regardless of who they are, and, anything along those lines, I think that's where it's got to start. And then we'll see more participants be recognized, we can track, we can measure, and I think that would then help folks when they come to settings like yours. They can relate to that now because they have students in their groups or their programs that they can identify with that group. So that would be my thought. But I think there needs to be training and support systems involved there. I think that would get us there eventually.
Tangential to your question, this is just the perfect time to give a quick shout out here to my good friend Sarah Marshall, who she's the CEO of Northside Federal Credit Union right here in Chicago and Uptown. They actually just got bought by Great Lakes Credit Union, but they're the first bank and credit union that specifically built products, both banking products and lending products for the trans community. And so if that's something people want to get to know a little more about, they're right here in Chicago.
Thank you.
Hi, Jared again. Just want to commend the amount of time being spent here about measurement. In my opinion, if you can't measure it, it doesn't even exist. So when we started looking at martial arts, there's very, very little studies done regarding the effects. I found a great one on aggression and violent behavior related to it. And everything leans towards, look, it does a great job building character and the potential of what it can do to develop that, especially in the real hard to reach kids, is there, but it needs to be conclusive. So where do you go to start looking for the dollars if they're that hard to come about, to put a kind of nail in the coffin on, look, martial arts isn't teaching kids to fight, these are the kids not fighting. So how would you take the study that I looked at and be able to continue on with that? Like, any advice on that would be helpful.
Well, there's universities that professors are always looking for ways to do research. And that was one area that we were going to discuss is if you want to work with a university, how do you approach a university? One, you can just, there's different departments. So if you're in need of more business analytics, then you can go to the market research group. If you're more into the psychometrics, then you can go to the psychology department. So you really have to understand what kind of research you want, and then target faculty at a local university. And you can just type in Google, professor and research, professor and psychometrics, and then see what pops up in your area and call them. And I always warn people, if professors don't get back to you, you're gonna contact them again, but if they don't get back to you after like 2 times, go to a next professor. Because you want somebody who's gonna be engaged and wants to work with you. So, but there's class projects. If the professor doesn't want to do the research, oftentimes they do class projects with these research, like there's education, School of Education has a research, School of Business has a research, psychology has a research class. They all have classes and they're all looking for projects. And so you can use either class projects, faculty and students, and there's oftentimes research centers. And then Catalyst, what's the name of that program we were talking about yesterday? There's universities here that have a program called something Catalyst.
Yeah, U Chicago and Northwestern both have. The Northwestern program is like Campus Catalyst or something.
That's it, Campus.
And then U Chicago with the Restandi Center, I think. Someone else in the room might know more about that. Don't quote me. But they also have a lot of capacity building along those lines.
But they'll get a student
Yeah.
intern. That's more of an internship program.
I'll add real quick, I'm sure we're running close on time, but just as you go through, I could definitely talk to you outside as well, but as you think of that impact, and it sounds like there's some bigger studies you've seen, I would encourage you to break up your thought process here into outputs and to outcomes, as I mentioned earlier, and start with what are your outputs and what outputs can you get through the work you're doing, and then get comfortable with that quickly or initially. You can use things like Google Drive, SurveyMonkey, pen and paper, obviously UpMetrics. You can do things like that. And then you talk about your outcomes. And let's say you're going to start with 30 kids in a program that you run. What outcomes can you measure with them over a 10-week, a 15-week, an 8-week program? And then you got yourself a study right there. And you could do all that through Google Drive pretty cleanly and quickly. So
I also want to just keep it funky. You were asking about funding, right?
Mm-hmm.
Were you asking about?
Yeah, how to get a research study or started. I never did that one yet.
Yeah, because you want money to start your own research.
Correct.
Okay. So here's what I would say. First, you should probably connect with Sport for Good Chicago.
I already made a note about you.
Yeah, real tangible thing to do. And then what I would also say is make sure that you understand that there are ethics in research that really require a lot of time and energy to put into. And so prioritize understanding if you want to even get involved with that, because ethics in research is something that make you think about doing something else. But just so you know, definitely great idea. Would love to see it come to fruition, but make sure you're prioritizing research ethics when you think about those things.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you.
So we have time for maybe one or two more super quick questions. Hi, my name is Michelle Stroud. I'm the Director of Development and Marketing for Dare to Try. You can read about the organization online or in the bio. My question relates to measuring impact, but in the context of, Pharlone, you mentioned seeing people, recognizing people. We talk a lot, we evaluate a lot, and I think most organizations do, the people that we're already serving. How many people were, qualitatively, did you enjoy the experience? Did you feel better? Did it do, how did it impact your life? Quantitatively, we look at how many participants were there, how many people attended or repeated, all of those kinds of measurements. But my question goes to kind of the total accessible market, putting it in context of, I serve 350 people a year and I measure those people and the impact in a variety of ways, but am I putting that in the context of the potential number of people that I could be serving? And so if you could just spend a minute or two talking about the importance of that and how to get at some of those measurements. I work with athletes, or my organization works with athletes with physical disabilities and visual impairments in sports. But I think in general, I think it would be really useful for people to understand, it's not just about who you serve, but I think it's useful to put it in the context of what percentage of the population, what potential do you have to be serving more? Yeah. Does anybody want to speak to that? I'll just say that that's super important from a consultant perspective. People that are interested in getting involved with your organization want to see that there's longevity and sustainability in the work that you're doing. And if you can't prove that there's a real need outside of the 350 people, just using the number you threw out, it's going to be hard to latch somebody on long term. if they're saying, okay, I've seen this and this is great work, but where's it gonna go? What's the possibility? So I think it's really important, and for you guys in the room here, if there are populations that you're not serving but you're working to get to, make sure those numbers are on there too, and have some plans in mind of how you're gonna start to reach those goals. Because just like she said, it's a great point, you know, if you're serving 350 people, could that look like in 5 years?
Well, what funders want is also, you can show the data, okay, we have so many Title I schools and so many lunches, etc. But then you have to say, how much is it per child that we need to serve?
Exactly.
So right now, the cost per child served. And so then they can see, okay, if we're gonna duplicate this and grow it and reach more kids, we need X, Y, Z money. So if you can.
Well, and I guess part of the question is how do you go about identifying the potential market? That's a question in general.
We do a lot around segmentation and pre-measurement. You know, from our side, a lot of it comes from public data, and so we want to see from a census tract perspective, things like what are the percentage of unbanked families, what are the low credit scores, where are there very few homeowners, and so on. And generally, that information is actually publicly available. And so, like we've been talking about the theory of change many times here, you have to begin with, all right, what is the population that I believe that my intervention is going to make the biggest difference in, and then go work from the beginning and say, all right, where or with whom is that population at its greatest density?
I also just want to say that, you know, that's a great question, but, you know, this is human-centered work, right? These are like individuals at the end of the day. And I would charge everyone in this room to understand that if you don't love the people you're trying to serve, if you're not in love with those people, stay out of that business. Because if you're in the community and you are judging them or you're making assumptions about them, if you're not madly in love with the people that you say you are trying to raise dollars for or make impact with, then all these questions are for naught.
Yeah, all right, last question.
Thank you. This has been a wonderful panel. This subject is about as far away from where I sit as possible, so I've learned a lot. My name is David Jacobson. I'm with Inflow Communications out in the San Francisco Bay Area. We're a consultancy. And I swear to God, I'm not a plant for either of these organizations, but I want to thank Pharlone for speaking truth to power. If you're not running in 2020, I'll vote for you in 2024. And one of my clients is called Fit Kids. It's an after-school fitness program for underserved youth. And the problems that she described that interfere with data collection are real in terms of mom's a crackhead and child only eats at school. And that there is nothing in that coach's mindset that says, I gotta get the data before I take care of this kid. Fortunately, we're also an UpMetrics customer, so our coaches get to use UpMetrics. It does help a lot, and I encourage its use. And again, as Pharlone was just saying, I've living in California, got to know some of the UpMetrics executives. Their hearts are totally in the right place, and they do love the population they serve. So you guys really brought this all together very neatly, and I just wanted to applaud you.
Awesome, thank you
so much.
Great, well, thanks everyone. We appreciate your time.
A couple of announcements. Lunch is going to be served just outside in the bar area. We're going to open up these windows and doors. It's a great little patio outside if you want to go out there and eat outside. I've got it down right now that we're at 12:37. I'd like to have everybody back here at 1:15 for Angela's keynote and in the afternoon program. So go and enjoy lunch. I encourage everybody to still go sign the poster boards outside for Howard Moore and for what sports philanthropy means to you. And thank you again for panel 3. Appreciate it.